Don't embarrass me. My husband didn't shout it. He didn't need to. He leaned toward my ear and let the words fall like ice down my collar. Quiet enough that no one else in the crowd would notice. Sharp enough that I felt it in my spine. We were standing beneath the east wing chandeliers of the White House, 30 feet past the first security checkpoint, surrounded by uniforms so pressed they looked poured rather than stitched. Marines stood at the doorways like statues that happened to breathe. Somewhere down the corridor a string quartet was tuning, and the air smelled like candle wax and old marble and somebody's expensive perfume. Ethan straightened the rows of ribbons on his Army service uniform for the third time in 2 minutes. He always did that when he was nervous and trying not to look it, smoothing fabric that was already flat, checking his reflection in whatever surface offered one. Stay close, he said, not looking at me. Smile when you're supposed to. This is a big night for me. I said nothing. I had learned somewhere over the last several years of our marriage that silence cost less than arguing. Ethan mistook my quiet for agreement. He always had. It was one of the many small mistakes that had, brick by brick, built the wall now standing between us. At the check-in table, a young staffer with a headset and a bright, professional smile held out her hand. Good evening. May I see your invitations? Ethan produced his cream-colored envelope like a man laying down a winning card. Here you are. She scanned the barcode. A soft, clean beep. Welcome, Colonel Harper, she said warmly. And Ethan's chest lifted half an inch, the way it always did when someone used his rank like a compliment. He turned to me with that small, satisfied smirk I had come to recognize over the years, the one that meant watch and learn. This is how it's done. I opened my handbag. Not for the invitation he had watched arrive in our mailbox 3 weeks earlier, the one he'd photographed and sent to his mother with 4 exclamation points. I reached past it, to the envelope beneath it. Different paper, different seal, different instructions folded inside, ones he had never seen and never would have understood if he had. The white house crest on the front caught the chandelier light and seemed, for a moment, to glow. Ethan's eyebrows pulled together. What is that? I didn't answer. I handed it to the staffer. She scanned it. The beep didn't come. Instead, the little screen on her tablet blinked, and her easy professional smile flickered and dropped like a curtain falling. She scanned it again. A third time. Her eyes lifted from the screen, searched the room, and landed on a tall man in navy dress whites, standing near the far archway, 4 silver stars gleaming on each shoulder board. Sir, she said, and her voice had changed entirely. Careful now. Almost reverent. She's here. The Admiral turned. The instant his eyes found me, something shifted in his posture, and he began walking toward us with the unmistakable gait of a man who has been waiting for this exact moment. Conversations near us thinned into silence, the way a room does when it senses something is about to happen and doesn't yet know what. Ethan looked from me, to the approaching Admiral, to me again. Confusion had replaced the smugness on his face so quickly it was almost funny. Almost. The Admiral stopped directly in front of me and extended his hand. Colonel Rachel Harper, he said. And there was genuine warmth in it, the kind you can't fake. We have been very much looking forward to this. Somewhere behind me, I heard my husband's breath catch. It's an honor to finally meet you in person. Admiral, I said. The honor is entirely ours, he replied. The President has asked to be notified the moment you arrived. I felt Ethan go rigid beside me. His voice cracked on the single word. The President? The Admiral glanced at him for exactly as long as courtesy required. You must be Colonel Ethan Harper. A pleasure. Then his attention returned to me and it never left again. If you'll come with me, ma'am. Everything is ready. Behind me, I heard my husband whisper to no one, to himself, to the marble floor, "What is happening?" I didn't answer. There would be time for that later, more time than either of us wanted, honestly. But this story didn't start in that hallway. It started almost a year before, back when I still believed patience was the same thing as love, and that if I simply endured long enough, my husband would finally see me. I was wrong about that. But I wasn't wrong about much else. My name is Rachel Harper. I'm 29 years old. And for nearly a decade, I served as an Army logistics officer. If you've never worked in military logistics, I understand the assumption. Most people picture spreadsheets, clipboards, a supply closet with too many fluorescent lights. Even Ethan used to joke, back when his jokes still had affection in them, that I was the queen of inventory. I used to laugh along. Not because it was funny, because explaining what I actually did would have meant discussing operations I wasn't cleared to discuss with my own husband. Operational security wasn't a suggestion. It was an oath, and I take my oaths seriously. Even the ones that cost me quiet at my own dinner table, while combat commanders became the recognizable faces of successful missions, the ones on magazine covers, the ones in hometown newspapers. People like me worked in the rooms behind those rooms. Fuel allocation, medical evacuation routing, aircraft scheduling across 3 time zones. Contingency planning for scenarios most people never learn happened. Because if we did our jobs correctly, they never had to. When everything worked, nobody noticed. When something failed, everyone did. I preferred it that way. My father served 32 years in the Army, and he used to tell me, the best officers don't chase applause. They chase responsibility. I tried to build a life around that sentence, even after I married a man who eventually forgot it entirely. When I met Ethan at Fort Liberty, he wasn't the man who whispered warnings at White House checkpoints. He laughed easily and often. He knew the names of every enlisted soldier in his platoon and used them. He stayed late helping junior officers rework their briefing slides without ever being asked. He admired people for their character, not their collar insignia. That was the man I fell in love with, and for a long time, I believed he still existed somewhere underneath the ribbons, but promotions changed some people. Not everyone. But some. With each new assignment, Ethan grew a little more preoccupied with how things appeared, and a little less curious about how things actually were. Every medal became a conversation opener. Every new rank made him marginally less interested in what anyone else in the room had accomplished. Especially, it seemed, at neighborhood cookouts, someone would ask what I did for work. And before I could open my mouth, Ethan would grin and say, "Rachel keeps everything organized." People laughed. "So she's the organized one," they'd say, and I would smile and let it go. Because arguing about it in front of a grill and 6 lawn chairs felt smaller than the insult itself. At his mother's dinner table, the introductions became a kind of ceremony. "My son is one of the Army's brightest young officers," she would announce, gesturing at Ethan with visible pride. Then, almost as an afterthought, a hand would wave toward me. "And Rachel works somewhere in logistics." As though my career were a footnote to his. No one meant serious harm, I told myself over and over for years. That was the story I kept telling myself. Because the alternative, that the people closest to me simply didn't think my work mattered, was harder to sit with. Eventually, Ethan stopped asking about my job altogether. He assumed the late nights meant paperwork. He assumed the classified calls meant scheduling conflicts. He assumed the sudden week-long trips were another conference. He never once imagined that some of those weeks determined whether thousands of American service members overseas would receive the fuel, the medicine, or the transport they needed to come home alive. I couldn't correct him. Not because I didn't trust him with the truth, but because I had signed documents promising I never would tell him, or anyone else outside a small, secure circle. So I carried 2 weights at once, the responsibility of the mission, and the particular loneliness of succeeding at something my own husband believed was beneath discussion. Looking back now, I can trace the exact season our marriage began to drift. It wasn't that Ethan stopped loving me. It was that he fell in love with something louder. Status. The night he pinned on Lieutenant Colonel, I was prouder than anyone in that room. We had spent years moving from post to post, missing birthdays, rescheduling anniversaries around deployment windows, celebrating milestones through grainy video calls at 3 in the morning. His promotion felt like something we had built together. Brick by brick, sacrifice by sacrifice. At least, that's what I thought it was. Within weeks, he started introducing himself by rank before name, not to strangers, which is normal enough in that world, but to old friends who'd known him since he was a lieutenant with holes in his boots. Every conversation, no matter where it began, found its way back to his command. And whenever someone turned the question toward me, he'd wave it off with the same practiced ease. Rachel keeps busy with logistics. Not army logistics. Not strategic logistics. Just logistics. Said the way you'd mention someone's hobby. I remember one retirement dinner outside Arlington with painful clarity. A retired Marine colonel, gray-haired and sharp-eyed, asked where I served. Before I could answer, Ethan laughed. Nothing exciting. She makes sure people get their supplies on time. The colonel smiled politely, but there was something knowing in his eyes. I spent 30 years in logistics support myself, he said, then looked directly at me. In my experience, that usually means you know where every skeleton in the command is buried. I smiled back. We try to prevent the skeletons in the first place. He laughed, a real laugh, warm and surprised. Ethan didn't. On the drive home, he stared through the windshield with his jaw set. You didn't have to try to impress him. I wasn't trying to impress anyone. I was answering his question. It sounded like you were correcting me. I answered a question you didn't finish answering. You know what I mean? I didn't, actually. But I had learned by then that saying so only extended the argument, and I was tired. So I let it go. That became the pattern. Every disagreement eventually collapsed into Ethan accusing me of being defensive, or sensitive, or his favorite, competitive, as though wanting to be seen accurately was some kind of contest. I was trying to win against him. Silence took less energy than fighting. But silence, I would learn, can quietly become permission. The less I pushed back, the more Ethan assumed there was nothing to push back against. Months later, my career took a turn Ethan never noticed happening. I was selected for a joint planning initiative spanning the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, and several civilian agencies. I'm still not permitted to name in casual conversation. The assignment required an expanded clearance, a fresh background investigation, and long stretches of time inside secure facilities where personal phones stayed locked in a box at the door. What exactly are you working on? Ethan asked one evening, more out of habit than curiosity. I can't talk about it. He rolled his eyes, already reaching for the remote. So, more paperwork? I let him think that. It hurt less than trying to explain why I couldn't explain at a family dinner not long after. He made the same joke to his relatives that he'd been making for months, dressed up slightly differently each time. The Army finally trusts her with bigger spreadsheets, he said, and the table chuckled on cue.
His mother beamed at him.
I'm just glad one of you has a career people can actually picture, she said. And I looked down at my plate and thought of my father's voice. Never measure your worth by the loudest person in the room. After dinner, my father-in-law, a quieter, gentler man than his son had become, followed me out to the porch and pressed a cup of coffee into my hands. You never defend yourself, he said. I don't see the point. He was quiet for a moment. My wife doesn't really understand what a military career looks like, he admitted. But Ethan does. That sentence stayed lodged in my chest for weeks. Because he was right, and that was exactly the problem. Ethan understood, better than almost anyone, how meaningful logistics work could be to an operation's survival. He simply didn't believe that my work, specifically mine, deserved that same understanding. Then Washington called, and everything accelerated. I reported to the Pentagon the following Monday. Inside a windowless conference room, the walls were covered floor to ceiling with maps and digital displays tracking overseas movements in real time, supply routes, humanitarian corridors, medical evacuation paths, fuel depots, emergency staging zones. For months, my life became an unbroken loop of classified briefings and 18-hour days. I left before sunrise more often than not. I came home well after midnight more often than that. Ethan barely noticed the pattern. He was busy noticing his own at a military social not long after. A colleague congratulated Ethan on a glowing evaluation, then turned politely to me. And how's work going, Colonel Harper? Before I could answer, Ethan laughed and cut in. Oh, don't get her started. If you ask Rachel, she'd tell you logistics is what actually runs the entire army. Everyone around us chuckled politely, the way people do when they sense a joke but aren't quite sure at whose expense it lands. I forced a smile and felt something inside me quietly crack, not because he'd embarrassed me in front of strangers, but because I understood in that instant that he genuinely believed what he'd said. He wasn't performing modesty on my behalf.
He actually thought it was true.
He had forgotten one of the oldest lessons in military service. One he used to teach to his own junior officers: victory belongs to everyone who made it possible, not only to the person standing tallest in the photograph. That autumn, 2 envelopes arrived on the same afternoon. Heavy cream stock, embossed seals, the kind of paper that announces its own importance before you've even opened it. Ethan tore his open first. "The White House," he shouted, loud enough that I heard him from the kitchen. "We've been invited." He held the card like a winning lottery ticket and immediately started calling people: his mother, his brother, 2 friends from his old command. Everyone got the same sentence, delivered with the same breathless pride: "I've been invited to the White House." He never once glanced at the second envelope sitting beneath mine on the counter. Different seal, different instructions, different arrival protocol entirely, printed in language that would have told him everything if he'd bothered to read it. I read every line twice, folded it carefully along its original creases, and slid it into the bottom drawer of my desk, beneath a stack of old training manuals where I knew he'd never look. That night, Ethan planned his outfit, his talking points, the exact photographs he intended to take. Over dinner, eyes bright, he said, "This is probably going to be the biggest night of my career." I looked at him for a long moment. Then I lowered my eyes to my plate. "No," I thought so quietly it barely counted as a thought at all. "It isn't." He never heard me. He rarely did by then. That ordinary dinner, with its ordinary excitement and its ordinary silence from me, turned out to be the last completely ordinary evening we would ever spend together. Which brings us back to where this story began. The White House hallway stretched ahead of us, marble underfoot reflecting the chandelier light in long golden streaks. Portraits of past presidents watched from the walls with the particular stillness of oil paint. Somewhere beyond the archway, a marine band played something soft and stately. Everything in that building seemed to whisper the same 3 words: honor, service, sacrifice. Ethan walked through it like the room already belonged to him. "Remember," he murmured as we crossed the checkpoint, "there are generals in this building tonight." "I know." "And cabinet officials." "I know. This isn't the place to strike up small talk with everyone you meet." "I understand," I said. And he nodded, satisfied, the way a teacher nods when a student repeats a lesson correctly. If only he had known which of us actually needed the reminder. And then came the second envelope. The scanner's silence. The staffer's changed expression. The Admiral crossing the room with purpose in his stride while conversations dimmed around us like a dial being turned down. "Colonel Rachel Harper," he'd said, extending his hand. "We've spoken several times over secure video conference. It's very good to finally meet in person." "Yes, sir, likewise." "The President asked to be notified the moment you arrived." I heard Ethan's sharp inhale behind me. "What?" The Admiral spared him a brief, courteous glance. "You must be Colonel Ethan Harper." "A pleasure, then, to me, if you'll come with me, ma'am." A protocol officer materialized at Ethan's elbow before he could take a single step after us. "I'm sorry, sir. Your seating assignment is this way." Ethan frowned, confused. "My wife is with me." "I'm aware, sir," the officer replied, unfailingly polite. "Colonel Harper has a separate seating arrangement this evening." Silence. Complete silence, the kind that seems to have a weight and a temperature. I turned and looked at my husband for the first time since we'd walked through the door. He searched my face for an explanation, some clue, some crack in the mask. I offered him none. There had been years of unanswered questions stacked up between us by then. That hallway, in front of half of official Washington, was not the place to start answering them. The Admiral led me into the East Room. where rows of gilt chairs stretched toward a raised platform. Cabinet secretaries, members of the Joint Chiefs, senators, Gold Star families seated with quiet dignity near the front, recipients of past military honors, humanitarian aid directors from 3 different agencies. This was not, I understood immediately, a simple evening reception. It was one of the year's most significant recognition ceremonies. And I had spent months trying very hard not to think about the fact that I was its reason for being held. The Admiral guided me to the second row, seats reserved. A small placard explained, for special honorees. Several senior officers rose slightly as I approached. An unspoken courtesy that made my face warm. A Navy Vice Admiral shook my hand first. Good to finally put a face to the name. An Air Force general nodded warmly. My staff speaks very highly of you, Colonel. The director of the Defense Logistics Agency laughed outright. I was beginning to think you weren't a real person. Just a very efficient rumor. I smiled and murmured something modest. Because most of these people knew me only as a voice on a secure line, a signature on a plan, a name attached to numbers that had, somehow, kept thousands of people alive. 8 rows back, Ethan stood frozen near the aisle, staring at the scene unfolding around me, as though it belonged to a different woman entirely. His commanding general leaned toward him. Ethan, do you know Colonel Harper personally? She's my wife, Ethan answered, almost automatically. The way you answer a question you've stopped really hearing. The general's eyebrows rose. You never mentioned that. For possibly the first time in the entirety of our marriage. My husband had no response prepared at all. The president entered with the Secretary of Defense at his side. The anthem played. The room rose, then settled. He stepped to the podium. Tonight, he began, we recognize Americans whose names rarely appear in newspapers. The men and women whose planning, whose discipline, whose quiet professionalism protects service members and civilians in places most of us will never see. I kept my eyes forward, my hands folded in my lap, my heart doing something complicated and unhelpful behind my ribs. Many of tonight's honorees worked under strict classification, he continued. Some couldn't tell their own families what they were doing or why they were gone so often, or why they came home exhausted and could offer no explanation. They accepted that burden willingly because the mission required it. A satellite image bloomed across the screen behind him. Supply routes rendered in glowing lines. Medical evacuation corridors, temporary shelter zones marked in careful grids. I recognized every line. I had drawn most of them myself, at 2 a.m, on a whiteboard that no longer exists because the room it was in has since been repurposed. Last year, the president said, one coordinated logistics operation prevented what senior analysts believe could have become one of the largest humanitarian disasters involving American personnel in recent memory. A murmur rolled through the room, genuine surprise. Because until that night, almost none of it had been public. It had lived, until that moment, only in classified briefings and my own memory. Planning that operation required extraordinary leadership across 5 military branches and half a dozen civilian agencies. The president continued. And the officer who led it has, on 4 separate occasions, declined individual recognition. My stomach tightened into a small, hard knot. I had known this moment was coming. I had rehearsed for it, in a sense, for weeks. Hearing it spoken aloud in that room, in that voice, was an entirely different thing. He looked toward my section. Colonel Rachel Harper. Would you please join me? Across the room, I watched my husband turn slowly to look at me. All the color had drained from his face. Not for one single day, been about him. I stood. The room rose with me, applause rolling forward in a wave. As I walked toward the stage, the Admiral leaned close and murmured, You've earned every second of this, Colonel. I didn't do it alone, I whispered back. I know, he said. That's exactly why you're the one standing up there. The president shook my hand at the podium. Colonel Harper, he said, the nation owes you its gratitude. It owes my team, sir, I answered. He smiled, and there was real warmth in it. That's exactly what everyone told me you'd say. Soft laughter moved through the room like a current. He turned back to the audience. Last spring, intelligence indicated that an Allied evacuation mission overseas could collapse within 72 hours. Analysts estimated that thousands of American service members, diplomatic staff, and civilians could be left stranded, some in active conflict zones. The room went utterly still. The solution required unprecedented cooperation between every military branch and multiple civilian agencies who do not historically cooperate easily. Colonel Rachel Harper coordinated that entire effort, from the initial contingency modeling to the final aircraft manifest. Applause again. Louder this time. Because of that leadership, he said. Not a single American life was lost during that evacuation. The applause that followed lasted long enough that I genuinely didn't know where to look. Every ounce of that praise belonged to hundreds of people beside me, pilots flying blind through weather they shouldn't have flown through, mechanics who hadn't slept in 2 days, nurses on evacuation flights, RDIO operators relaying coordinates in the dark, young enlisted soldiers loading pallets onto aircraft at 3 in the morning because the window to leave was closing by the minute. I accepted the framed presidential Distinguished Civil Military Service Medal with both hands and stepped, somewhat unsteadily, to the microphone. The room quieted. I wasn't expecting to speak, I admitted, and a few people smiled. But there's something I'd like to say. I looked out across the room, at the generals, the senators, the Gold Star families, the mechanics turned officers scattered somewhere in those rows. My father served in the Army for 32 years, I said. He taught me that leadership isn't measured by how many people salute you when you walk into a room. It's measured by how many people succeed because you quietly did your job well and asked for nothing in return. Several veterans in the audience nodded, slow and knowing. I accept this on behalf of the people whose names will never appear in a headline. The mechanics, the planners, the logisticians, the radio operators, the medics, the families waiting at home for a phone call that means their person is safe. They are the reason this mission succeeded. They are the reason people came home. The applause that followed lasted longer than any that came before it. When I finally stepped back, the president leaned toward me. You just made my speech better, he said quietly. I doubt that. Sir, I don't, he said, and moved on to the next honoree. The ceremony ran another hour. Afterward, guests drifted into the reception rooms, and the Admiral found me first. You've become quite popular tonight, he said, amused. I'd honestly rather disappear. He laughed. I believe that. It's exactly why the mission worked. Cabinet officials stopped to shake my hand. A retired senator told me a story about her own father's service that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with why she'd wanted to meet me. A Navy captain mentioned, almost in passing, that his teenage grandson had decided, after hearing my remarks, that he wanted to become a logistics officer someday. That single sentence meant more to me than the medal now weighing down my hand. Then I saw Ethan. He was standing alone near a tall window that looked out over the south lawn. His earlier confidence gone entirely, replaced by something smaller and far more honest. When our eyes finally met across the room, he walked toward me slowly, like a man approaching something he wasn't sure would still be there when he arrived. Rachel. His voice had lost its usual certainty. I waited. I didn't know, he said. I know. No, I mean it. I really didn't know. I know that too. He looked down at the floor. I thought logistics meant paperwork. You thought my logistics meant paperwork. He closed his eyes. I was wrong. You were. I embarrassed myself tonight. I shook my head gently. No, Ethan, you embarrassed yourself long before tonight. Tonight just happened to be the night everyone else finally saw it too. His shoulders dropped, the fight going out of him all at once. I never saw you, he said, so quietly I almost missed it. Not really. Not in years. That sentence hurt more than anything else he'd said all evening, precisely because it wasn't cruel. It was simply finally true. I saw your rank, he went on. I saw your job title on a form somewhere. I never once stopped to actually see you. Before I could find an answer, his commanding general approached, and the moment shifted. Ethan, the general said, then looked between the two of us and sighed. A long, weary sound. I've known Colonel Harper's work for the better part of a year now. The operation she led saved careers. He paused, correcting himself deliberately. No, it saved lives. You knew? Ethan asked. Of course I knew, the general said. What I don't understand is how you spent this long married to a remarkable officer and somehow never realized it.
He wasn't angry when he said it.
He sounded disappointed, which I noticed, landed on Ethan far harder than anger ever could have. After the general walked away, Ethan stood beside me in silence for a long moment. Finally, he asked the question that had clearly been building behind his eyes since the checkpoint. Why didn't you tell me? Because I legally couldn't. I understand that. But even if I could have, I said, turning to look at him fully, I'm not sure you would have listened. His eyes filled. And for the first time since I'd known him, there was no rank in his expression, no medals, no performance for an invisible audience. Just a man being asked quietly and without cruelty to sit with the difference between admiration and respect, and beginning, however slowly, to understand that one had never been a substitute for the other. People imagine revenge as something loud. Slammed doors. Public humiliation. A carefully engineered moment designed to make someone hurt exactly as much as they've hurt you. A year earlier, I might have believed that too. But standing in the White House that night with a medal I had never once asked for, pinned to a dress I'd bought on sale specifically because I hadn't wanted to draw attention to myself, I understood something I hadn't expected to learn. The greatest revenge was never about making Ethan feel small. It was about finally, after years of quietly disappearing into other people's introductions of me, seeing myself clearly. For years I had measured the health of my marriage by how much patience I could produce on demand. I believed endurance and love were the same substance wearing different names. I told myself that if I worked hard enough, stayed quiet enough, remained understanding enough for long enough, Ethan would eventually turn around and truly see me, the truth. It turns out is simpler and considerably less comfortable. People rarely learn on their own timeline to value something they've spent years overlooking. Sometimes, not always, but sometimes they only learn it after they've already lost it, or come dangerously close to losing it entirely. As the reception thinned and guests filtered toward the exits, I stood near the entrance for a while, letting the cool night air settle over me. A brief spring rain had passed through earlier. The pavement outside still held the reflected shimmer of the streetlights, and Washington looked for a moment almost soft. Behind me, footsteps approached. I was hoping you hadn't left yet, Ethan said. His voice sounded different now, not commanding, not performing. Just tired in a way I hadn't heard from him in years. I've been thinking, he said. I imagine you have. I owe you more than an apology. He paused. I owe you years of respect I never actually gave you. Neither of us spoke for a moment. When we met at Fort Liberty, he finally said, I admired everything about you. You were smarter than me, calmer than me. I knew that even then. So what changed? He looked down at the wet sidewalk. I started chasing promotions instead of chasing the person I wanted to be. Somewhere along the way, I convinced myself my rank made me more important than the people around me. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. I spent years teaching young officers about servant leadership. I never once practiced it at my own kitchen table. That kind of honesty mattered to me more than I expected it to. Excuses can be rehearsed in front of a mirror. Honesty like that usually can't be. I don't expect forgiveness tonight, he said. You shouldn't give it to me. I just wanted you to know. He swallowed hard. I'm ashamed of the husband I've been. I nodded. Once, and then I walked away, not because I hated him, but because real healing doesn't happen in a single conversation on a wet sidewalk outside the White House, no matter how sincere that conversation is. Some things take longer than one honest night to rebuild, if they can be rebuilt at all. Over the months that followed, Our lives moved in genuinely different directions. I accepted a teaching assignment at the Army Logistics University in Virginia, mentoring the next generation of young officers preparing to carry weight they didn't yet fully understand. I discovered, somewhat to my surprise, that I loved teaching even more than I had loved planning operations. On the first day of every new class, I wrote a single sentence across the whiteboard: "Leadership begins with respect." Then I asked each group of students what that sentence actually meant to them. The answers were always different, and I never got tired of hearing them. Ethan, on his own, requested a transfer out of his command. No one made him do it. He said he wanted to rebuild the kind of leader and the kind of man he had once been, before rank became the only mirror he trusted. He also enrolled, quietly and without announcing it to his mother this time, in a leadership counseling program through the Army. A mutual friend told me something months later that stayed with me. "He never talks about the White House ceremony," she said. "What does he talk about?" The day he realized he'd stopped listening to the one person who actually knew him. That sentence felt more meaningful to me than any punishment I could have designed myself. If I'd ever wanted to design one, which, in the end, I hadn't. 8 months after the ceremony, I got a text message. "Would you meet me?" No expectations. Just coffee. I stared at it for a long time before I answered. Then I typed back. 1 hour, we met at a small cafe overlooking the Potomac. No uniforms. No medals. No cameras. Just 2 people who had once promised, in front of witnesses, to spend their lives together. Sitting across a small table with 2 cups of coffee going cold between them. He looked healthier, calmer, older. Somehow, not in years but in something harder to name. He didn't open with an apology. He'd already given that to me on a sidewalk months earlier. Instead, he asked about my students. I asked about his new unit. We laughed, a little disbelievingly, about our first apartment near Fort Liberty, where the air conditioner had never worked properly and the kitchen table had doubled as both a desk and, once memorably, an ironing board, for the first time in years. The conversation felt like it belonged to both of us equally. As we were finishing our coffee, he reached into his jacket pocket. "I found this while I was cleaning out my desk," he said, and handed me a small, slightly creased photograph. It was from the week we'd graduated officer candidate school together. We stood side by side in the picture. No medals yet, no impressive titles. Nothing but 2 young officers grinning at a future neither of us could have predicted. "One missed those 2 people," he said quietly. "So do I. I don't know if we can ever really become them again." I looked at the photograph a moment longer, then smiled gently. "We shouldn't try to. We're supposed to become better than they were, not go back to being them." He seemed surprised by that, and then slowly, he nodded. That was the last thing either of us said before we stepped back outside into the ordinary afternoon. Whether our marriage ultimately survived isn't really the point of this story. And it isn't the part I think about most, even now. Some endings simply don't fold neatly into a final chapter. And I've made peace with that. What matters, I think, is this: Ethan became a humbler officer, and eventually a humbler man. I became a stronger version of the woman I'd already been underneath all that quiet. And neither of us, from that night forward, ever confused rank with worth again. Never underestimate the quietest person in the room. The people who seek the least attention are very often carrying the greatest responsibility, the missions no one applauds, the sacrifices no one photographs, the work that only becomes visible the moment it fails. Titles fade eventually. Uniforms get folded away and stored in closets. Medals gather dust in drawers nobody opens anymore. But character is what people remember, long after the ribbons have gone dull. And sometimes, the person standing quietly beside you isn't small at all. They're simply disciplined enough not to announce their own importance, right up until the moment the whole room finds out for them.